Good to see everybody.
That number's supposed to be 935.
935 will be the song of invitation. We find in the Beatitudes, Jesus has many teachings that are suitable for us today. And the one I'm going to look at this evening is found in Matthew 5, verse 5. And there are reasons why I chose to speak on this evening, because it kind of fits in with me. So this particular beatitude says, "Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth." Some translations say, "Blessed are the meek," or the humble. And the Greek word from each of these words has been translated in the various versions in the word praeus, a difficult word to define. There just seems to be no single term that is capable of expressing all that is included in this virtue. In classical Greek, it is a lovely word that means gentle. It is used, for example, of a gentle breeze or a gentle voice. When used of persons, it means one who is mild or gracious. But mild and gracious do not fully explain praeus either. Our English words, mild, gracious, gentle, and meek, have created a concept of gentleness that is entirely different from the gentleness of the Greek word praeus. The word tends to make us think of a meek or gentle person as a spineless, milquetoast creature who is devoid of manly vigor and courage. And you've probably heard someone use the phrase meek as a mouse when speaking of a quiet, inobtrusive person. We never speak of a meek big man, but always of meek little men. The gentleness of this beatitude is not that of weakness, but it's a gentleness of strength. It is a truly heroic quality. There was a special use of the Greek word praeus that shed some light on the understanding of its meaning. When an animal was tamed, it was said to be praeus. A horse that was once wild but which has become obedient to the bit and bridle was said to be praeus. Perhaps this is the secret to understanding the meaning of praeus. There is a gentleness in this word, but behind the gentleness, there is a strength of steel, a conscious composure, and a perfect control. William Barclay perhaps put it more simply when he said that the man who is praeus is the man who is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time. I don't know about you, but this understanding of gentleness makes this beatitude one of the most difficult for me to master. As a matter of fact, such a characteristic cannot be attained simply through one's own efforts. Gentleness or meekness is strength under control. But it would be wrong to say that the one who is gentle is one who is perfectly self-controlled, because only God can give him that perfect mastery of strength that can rightly be called praeus or gentleness. For example, I don't know if there's anybody here where this might fit in, but those of us who play golf can understand this concept. It is true that it takes more strength in the hands to make the ball go a short distance than it does to make it go a longer distance. In the action of chipping or You're next to the green and you're chipping onto the green. You must stop your hands from going so far after making contact with the ball to enable it to go only a short distance. That's very difficult for a lot of people. This virtue has been described as the captain at the helm of his ship in the midst of the storm, in full control of his vessel as he guides it steadily through the storm. True gentleness, as defined by the word praise, is not a natural quality. It is not something with which we are born or that we obtain through environmental influences. It is something we attain through our association with God and by His grace. In Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, it is stated that the man Moses was very humble or meek, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And you say, you got to be kidding. We're talking about Moses, right? Moses wasn't born with this gentleness. He wasn't meek or gentle by nature. He was anything but gentle or meek when in anger he slew the Egyptian taskmaster. Moses became meek as a result of his association with God. It wasn't gentleness that caused Peter to cut off the ear of Malchus when Jesus was taken into custody, or that caused him to curse when he was accused of being one of Jesus' followers. But by the grace of God and as a result of Peter's poverty of spirit, he came to be a meek apostle who without hypocrisy would later write these words: "Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden power of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God." 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4. We as Christians must exhibit a gentleness toward God. Gentleness relates the Christian to God because it is the spirit of submissiveness that enables a person to become God-tamed. Notice the characteristics, if you will, of a gentle or meek person's relationship to God. First, he is not aggressive toward God, nor is he demanding of Him. Secondly, he lays no claim to deserving God's goodness. By all means, none of us deserve what God has done for us. And thirdly, he puts his trust in God and obeys Him. His is the spirit of submissiveness expressed by Paul as we know it in Galatians 2, verse 20, when Paul said very simply, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself up for me." The gentle person accepts God's dealings with him as always for his good. He accepts them on God's terms. Many people, as we know, lose faith in God because He will not break or even bend His laws for their sake. Well, why can't it be this way? Or why does God demand this of us? Well, a gentle person trusts in the providence of God even when he doesn't understand it. God says that this is the way we are to be, therefore that's the way we should try to be. Job, for instance, who endured pain, agony, and material loss without cursing God, is an example of the courage and patience that comes from gentleness. Gentleness allows God to do with the Christian what the scientist and engineer is able to do in the physical realm. The engineer takes a rushing, turbulent river and controls the power so that it is no longer destructive, but is instead used to illuminate homes and run the machinery of industry. The Lord doesn't do away with the out-of-control energy of a new Christian. Take, for example, his temper. He puts it under control. He redirects it so that it will no longer be the means of destruction, of sin, and of injury to others. Instead, it becomes the means of glorifying God and serving mankind. Paul is an excellent example. A Christian without a temper at all might be as useless to God as a Christian with a terrible temper, of a Christian whose temper has not been God-tamed. Consider Romans 12, verse 2. And do not be conformed to this world. And there's a lot to be said to what Paul is saying here. Don't react the way the world does. Don't lose control of oneself the way the world does. If things don't go your way, don't lose control. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. The gentle Christian has been transformed by the renewing of his mind, and his life is not a life of destruction, but a life that proves what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Gentleness toward man is commanded. We've read in Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, as Paul writes to Titus, remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good deed, to malign no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing every consideration for all men. The Christian is to be gentle and considerate to all men. And if we were, wouldn't this world be a much better place to live in? There is to be no respect of persons. The same consideration is to be given to friends and enemies alike. Excuse me. And regardless of economic, social, or educational status, inferiors, as the world would grade them, are to be treated as courteously as our peers or even our superiors. In other words, every human being on the face of the earth is on the same level as far as God is concerned. Who was it that Jesus was accused of eating and dining with? With sinners, right? The sinners of his time. When that, in reality, they were probably not near as sinful as the ones who were accusing him of being, accusing him of doing that very thing. But you see, gentleness toward man is not to be confused with things like apathy, weakness, or insensibility to wrong. The individual who is pious feels anger on the right grounds, against the right persons, in the right manner, at the right moment, and for the right length of time. Ephesians 4, verses 26 and 27, Paul writes, be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. The Bible presents anger as a choice. It is not to be a spontaneous compulsion. Gentleness will not yield on a principle of righteousness. Neither will it compromise with evil. God-given gentleness will stand up for God-given principles. Notice Paul's attitude in Galatians 2, verses 3 through 5. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. The gentle Christian feels anger concerning wrongdoing, but does not allow it to degenerate into hatred and cause him to sin against the wrongdoers. It motivates him to seek a solution to the problem. As Peter writes in 1 Peter 2, verse 20, "For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God." And in Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3, Paul writes to the church in Ephesus, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." And then we read in Colossians 3, verses 12 through 15. "So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful." Notice, if you would, in those two passages where he speaks about the necessity of being gentle. A Christian who mourns over the sins of others uses his gentleness in an effort to restore them. We read in Galatians 6, verse 1, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness." And then again, Paul writing to the young preacher in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 through 26. "The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God may grant them repentance leading to the knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will." So if we are gentle toward them, they're more than likely going to respond to what you have to say about God, what you have to say or teach about Jesus Christ, and what you have to say about how they are living their lives in sin and that they need to correct their lives by turning to Jesus. If we do it in a gentle fashion, in a way by which they can see that we really care. And then, of course, we find that Jesus is our perfect example of gentleness. We see the moral strength and courage of gentleness perfectly exemplified by Christ our Savior. Notice how he describes himself in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Doesn't that just make your heart feel good, knowing that it's Jesus who is saying this? For I am gentle and humble in heart. Therefore, bring all things to me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. So let us take a look at his gentleness in action, okay? He felt strong indignation concerning the sins of men. We read in Matthew 21, verses 12 and 13. Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And the first response we get from reading that is, well, Jesus lost his temper, right? He was angry. And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a robber's den. Again, he did it for the right reason, at the right time, for the right length of time. And he didn't dwell on it. He just simply told them why he was doing it. Then we read just a couple chapters later, chapter 23, verses 13 through 15. He speaks about the scribes and the Pharisees. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. But you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Boy, that's rather harsh, isn't it? But he was telling it the way it was. And he was doing it for the right reason. And they needed to see that they were wrong in what they did. He was angry at the conduct of the money changers and the scribes and Pharisees on the right grounds, in the right manner, at the right moment, and for the right length of time. However, the displeasure he manifested toward an individual because of his sins in no way denied the love he had for him as a precious human soul made in the image of God. He was doing it for their own good and for those who were seeing what he was doing. Notice his perfect composure. 1 Peter 2, verse 23. Peter says, and while being reviled, speaking of Jesus, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously, knowing full well that it was his Father who is going to be the final judge. We read in Luke 23, verse 34. Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And then he goes on and says, they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. They were unconcerned what Jesus was saying about the Father forgiving them. And yet still, Jesus was showing a willingness to do that very thing. Consider this prophetic description by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. And then the prophet gives an example of what he's talking about. like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. This third beatitude, of which we've been speaking of, describes a quality that is not weak. Christian gentleness is strong and courageous. It takes moral strength and courage to be submissive to God and His will. It takes moral strength and courage to be angry at the sight of sin, and yet to treat the sinner with gentleness and gracious consideration. It takes moral strength and courage to walk against the grain of society. It takes moral strength and courage to be patient and forbearing toward one's enemies. It takes moral strength and courage to deal with every human being, regardless of his station in life, in the spirit of gentleness. Christian gentleness is the essence of moral strength and courage, as Jesus exemplifies. Now, as Jesus gave out the blessings of those who are gentle, He also gave a reward for those who would seek this gentleness of which He's speaking of. For they shall inherit the earth. What does that mean? The gentle do inherit the earth. They receive the very best that human beings are able to enjoy in this present world. Notice what Paul had to say in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 21 through 23. So then, let no one boast in men. For all things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come. All things belong to you, and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. Christians may not legally own a square inch of land, but they recognize the entire earth as the creation of their Father, a creation for them to enjoy in all its beauty and splendor. Don't you just marvel at the sunset each evening? And aren't you just amazed that the sun rises about the same time every morning? And then as the wind blows and you say, wow, I wish the wind would stop, but nonetheless, God sees a purpose for the wind, doesn't He? And a change of seasons, and the stars at night, and they all stay in their place. And we live in what we call the Milky Way, but there are galaxies and universes far, far beyond what we can even imagine. And they're all in the same space as we know it to be. It doesn't change. That's our God. But you see, Christians enjoy the best that men have to give, and that is love and friendship. The aggressor may win the outward allegiance of people by the force of arms, but he can never win their hearts nor gain their affections. Who is more the possessor of the world? There are many who think they can gain the world to be their own. Thus we have wars, trying to gain land that they can be considered the emperors of. But he who has 1,000 houses, or he who without one house to call his own, has 10, in which his knock at the door would receive a jubilant welcome. He who has great wealth may, if he loses it, have no refuge. On the other hand, one who has practically nothing may have 100 who would sacrifice their comfort to supply his necessities. Who is the wealthiest? Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. The strong tamed, made useful, and inherit the earth. Have you ever heard of such a description of the Lord's church? Well, here is a prophetic description of the peaceful nature of the Lord's church written in symbolic language. If you turn to Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And just picture this scene happening, okay? Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also righteousness will be the belt about his waist. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. Also the cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Wow, can you imagine that? Everything contrary to our knowledge as to what will happen, the prophet says this is the way it's going to be in the Lord's church. Jesus, as you know, is the shoot that will spring from the stem of Jesse. And this is the way it is to be in his church. It's not a picture of some future utopia. It is a picture of the peaceful nature that is to epitomize the church today. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. May the gentleness of this beatitude be one of our goals, not only for the sake of now, but for the assurance of that inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for us. As Peter writes in 1 Peter 1, verse 4. What does it mean to be gentle? What does he mean when he says, these are the ones that shall inherit the earth? Regardless of the oppression that we see around us in our world today, nonetheless we find that Jesus speaks, it is the gentle who will inherit the earth. It are the gentle who shall receive the promises of heaven. And just as we spoke of the peaceful nature in Isaiah, so it can be for us in the church today. Lesson is yours. And if there be anybody here this evening who needs to respond to the invitation as we give it now at this time, and have not yet repented of your sins, to put Christ on in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, we invite you to do so now, as together we stand and as we sing.